Hello, everybody. This is Psychology of the Unconscious by Carl Jung. Chapter 1, Concerning Two Kinds of Thinking, Part 2. Let us leave aside the query as to why we possess these two different ways of thinking, and turn back to the second proposition, namely, how comes it that we have two different ways of thinking? I've intimated above that history shows us that directed thinking was not always as developed as it is at present. In this age, the most beautiful expression of directed thinking is science and the technique fostered by it. Both things are indebted for their existence simply to the energetic education and directed thinking. At the time, however, when a few forerunners of the present culture, like the poet Petrarch, first began to appreciate nature understandingly, there was already in existence an equivalent for our science, to wit, scholasticism. This took its objects from the fantasies of the past, and it gave to the mind a dialectic training in directed thinking. The only success which beckoned the thinker was rhetorical victory in disputation, and not a visible transformation of reality. The subjects of thinking were often astonishingly fantastical. For example, questions were discussed, such as how many angels could have a place in the point of a needle, whether Christ could have done his work of redemption equally well if he had come into the world as a pea. The possibility of such problems, to which belong the metaphysical problems in general, viz. To be able to know the unknowable, shows us of what peculiar kind that mind must have been which created such things, which to us are the height of absurdity. Nietzsche had guessed, however, at the biological background of the phenomenon which he spoke of, the beautiful tension of the Germanic mind which the Middle Ages created. Taken historically, scholasticism, in the spirit of which persons of towering intellectual powers, such as Thomas of Aquinas, Duns Scotus, Abelard, William of Ockham, and others, have labored, is the mother of the modern scientific attitude, and in a later time will see clearly how and in what scholasticism still furnishes living undercurrents to the science of today. Its whole nature lies in dialectic gymnastics which have raised the symbol of speech, the word, to an almost absolute meaning, so that it finally attained to that substantiality which expiring antiquity could lend to its logos only temporarily, through attributes of mystical valuation. The great work of scholasticism, however, appears to be the foundation of firmly knitted intellectual sublimation, the conditio sine qua non of a modern scientific and technical spirit. Should we go further back into history, we shall find that which today we call science dissolved into the indistinct cloud. The modern culture-creating mind is incessantly occupied in stripping off of all subjectivity from experience, and in finding those formulas which bring nature and her forces to the best and most fitting expression. It would be an absurd and entirely unjustified self-glorification if we were to assume that we are more energetic or more intelligent than the ancients. Our materials for knowledge have increased, but not our intellectual capacity. For this reason, we become immediately as obstinate and insusceptible in regard to new ideas as people in the darkest times of antiquity. Our knowledge has increased, but not our wisdom. The main point of our interest is displaced wholly into material reality. Antiquity preferred a mode of thought which was more closely related to a fantastic type, except for a sensitive perspicuity towards works of art not attained since then. We seek in vain in antiquity for that precise and concrete manner of thinking characteristic of modern science. We see the antique spirit create not science, but mythology. Unfortunately, we acquire in school only a very paltry conception of the richness and immense power of life of Grecian mythology. Therefore, at first glance, it doesn't seem possible for us to assume that that energy and interest which today we put into science and technique, the man of antiquity gave in great part to his mythology. That nevertheless gives the explanation for the bewildering changes, the kaleidoscopic transformations and new syncretistic groupings, and the continued rejuvenation of the myths in the Grecian sphere of culture. Here, we move in a world of fantasies, which, little concerned with the outer course of things, flows from an inner source, and, constantly changing, creates now plastic, now shadowy shapes. The fantastical activity of the mind, created artistically par excellence. The object of the interest does not seem to have been to grasp hold of the how of the real world, as objectively and exactly as possibly, but to aesthetically adapt subjective fantasies and expectations. There was little place among ancient people for the coldness and disillusion which Giordano Bruno's thoughts on eternity and Kepler's discoveries brought to modern humanity. The naive man of antiquity saw in the sun the great father of the heaven and earth, and in the moon the fruitful good mother. Everything had its demons. They animated equally a human being and his brother, the animal. Everything was considered according to its anthropomorphic or theromorphic attributes, as human being or animal. Even the disk of the sun was given wings and 4 feet, in order to illustrate its movement. Thus arose an idea of the universe which was not only very far from reality, but was one which corresponded wholly to subjective fantasies. We know, from our experience, this state of mind. It is an infantile stage. To the child, the moon is a man or a face or a shepherd of the stars. The clouds in the sky seem like little sheep. The dolls drink, eat, and sleep. The child places a letter at the window for the Christ child. He calls to the stork to bring him a little brother or sister. The cow is the wife of the horse, and the dog the husband of the cat. We know, too, the lower races look upon the locomotive as an animal, and call the drawers of the table the child of the table. As we learn through Freud, the dream shows a similar type. Since the dream is unconcerned with the real condition of things, it brings the most heterogeneous matter together, and a world of impossibilities takes the place of realities. Freud finds progression characteristic of thinking when awake, and that is to say, the advancement of the thought excitation from the system of the inner or outer perception through the endo-psychic work of association, conscious and unconscious, to the motor end, that is to say, towards innervation. In the dream, he finds the reverse, namely regression of the thought excitation from the preconscious or unconscious to the system of perception, by the means of which the dream receives its ordinary impression of sensuous distinctness, which can rise to an almost hallucinating clearness. The dream thinking moves in a retrograde manner towards the raw material of memory. The structure of the dream thoughts is dissolved during the progress of regression into the raw material. The reanimation of the original perception is, however, only one side of regression. The other side is regression to the infantile memory material, which might also be understood as regression to the original perception, but which deserves a special mention on account of its independent importance. This regression might indeed be considered as historical. The dream, according to this conception, might also be described as the substitute of the infantile scene, changed through transference into the recent scene. The infantile scene cannot carry through its revival. It must be satisfied with its return as a dream. From this conception of the historical side of regression, it follows consequently that the modes of conclusion of the dream, in so far as one may speak of them, must show at the same time an analogous and infantile character. This is truly the case, as experience has abundantly shown, so that today everyone who is familiar with the subject of dream analysis confirms Freud's proposition that dreams are a piece of the conquered life of the childish soul. Inasmuch as the childish psychic life is undeniably of an archaic type, this characteristic belongs to the dream in quite an unusual degree. Freud calls our attention to this especially. The dream, which fulfills its wishes by a short regressive path, affords us only an example of the primary method of working of the psychic apparatus which has been abandoned by us as unsuitable. That which once ruled in the waking state when the psychical life was still young and impotent appears to be banished to the dream life, in somewhat the same way as the bow and arrow, those discarded primitive weapons of adult humanity, have been relegated to the nursery. All this experience suggests to us that we draw a parallel between the fantastical, mythological thinking of antiquity and the similar thinking of children, between the lower human races and dreams. The train of thought's not a strange one for us, but quite familiar through our knowledge in comparative anatomy and the history of development, which shows us how the structure and function of the human body are the result of a series of embryonic changes which correspond to similar changes in the history of the race. Therefore, the supposition is justified that ontogenesis corresponds in psychology to phylogenesis. Consequently, it would be true as well that the state of infantile thinking in the child's psychic life, as well as in dreams, is nothing but a re-echo of the prehistoric and the ancient. In regard to this, Nietzsche makes a very broad and remarkable standpoint. In our sleep and in our dreams, we pass through the whole thought of earlier humanity. I mean, in the same way that man reasons in his dreams, he reasoned when in the waking state many thousands of years. The first causa which occurred to his mind in reference to anything that needed explanation satisfied him and passed for truth. In the dream, this atavistic relic of humanity manifests its existence within us, for it is the foundation upon which the higher rational faculty developed, and which is still developing in the individual. The dream carries us back into earlier states of human culture, and affords us a means of understanding it better. The dream thought is too easy to us now, because we're so thoroughly trained to it through the interminable stages of evolution, during which this fantastic and facile form of theorizing has prevailed. To a certain extent, the dream is a restorative for the brain, which during the day is called upon to meet the severe demands for trained thought, made by the conditions of a higher civilization. From these facts, we can understand how lately more acute logical thinking, the taking seriously of cause and effect, has been developed, when our functions of reason and intelligence still reach back involuntarily to those primitive forms of conclusion. We live about half our lives in this condition. We've already seen that Freud, independently of Nietzsche, has reached a similar standpoint from the basis of dream analysis. The step from this established proposition to the perception to the myths as familiar dream images is no longer a great one. Freud has formulated this conclusion himself. The investigation of this folk psychologic formation, myths, etc., is by no means finished at present. To take an example of this, however, is probable that the myths correspond to the distorted residue of wish fantasies of whole nations, the secularized dreams of young humanity. Rank understands the myths in a similar manner, as a mass dream of the people. Ricklin has insisted rightly upon the dream mechanism of the fables, and Abraham has done the same for the myths. He says, "The myth is a fragment of the infantile soul life of the people, and thus the myth is sustained, still remaining fragment from the infantile soul life of the people, and the dream is the myth of the individual." An unprejudiced reading of the above-mentioned authors will certainly allay all doubts concerning the intimate connection between dream psychology and myth psychology. The conclusion results almost from itself that the age which created the myths thought childishly, that is to say fantastically, as in our age, is still done, to the very great extent, associatively or analogically, in dreams. The beginnings of myth formations in the child, the taking of fantasies for realities, which is partly in accord with the historical, may easily be discovered among children. One might raise the objection that the mythological inclinations of children are implanted by education. The objection is futile. Has humanity at all ever broken loose from the myths? Every man has eyes and all his senses to perceive that the world is dead, cold, and unending, and he has never yet seen a god, nor brought to light the existence of such from empirical necessity. On the contrary, there was need of a fantastic, indestructible optimism, and one far removed from all sense of reality, in order, for example, to discover in the shameful death of Christ really the highest salvation and the redemption of the world. Thus, one can indeed withhold from a child the substance of earlier myths, but not take from him the need for mythology. One can say that we should happen that all traditions in the world were cut off with a single blow, then, with the succeeding generation, the whole mythology and history of religion would start over again. Only a few individuals succeed in throwing off mythology in a time of certain intellectual supremacy. The mass never frees itself. Explanations are of no avail. They merely destroy a transitory form of manifestation, but not the creating impulse. Let us again take up our earlier train of thought. We spoke of the ontogenetic re-echo of the phylogenetic psychology among children. We saw that fantastic thinking is a characteristic of antiquity, of the child, and the lower races. But now we know also that our modern and adult man is given over in large part to the same fantastic thinking, which enters as soon as the directed thinking ceases. A lessening of the interest, a slight fatigue, is sufficient to put an end to the directed thinking, the exact psychological adaptation to the real world, and to replace it with fantasies. We digress from the theme and give way to our own trains of thought. If the slackening of attention increases, then we lose by degrees the consciousness of the present, and the fantasy enters into possession of the field. Here the important question obtrudes itself. How are fantasies created? From the poets we learn much about it. From science we learn little. The psychoanalytic method presented to science by Freud shed light upon this for the first time. It showed us that there are typical cycles. The stutterer imagines he is a great orator. The truth of this, Demosthenes, thanks to his energy, is proven. The poor man imagines himself to be a millionaire, the child an adult. The conquered fight out victorious battles with the conqueror. The unfit torments or delights himself with ambitious plans. We imagine that which we lack. The interesting question of the why of all this we must leave here unanswered, while we return to the historic problem. From what source do the fantasies draw their materials? We chose, for example, a typical fantasy of puberty, a child in that stage before whom the whole frightening uncertainty of the future fate opens, puts back the uncertainty into the past through his fantasy and says, if only I were not a child of my ordinary parents, but the child of a rich and fashionable count, and had been merely passed over to my parents, then some day a golden coach would come, and the count would take his child back to him with his wonderful castle. And so it goes on, as in Grimm's fairy tales, which the mother tells to her children. With a normal child, it stops with the fugitive, quickly passing idea, which is soon covered over and forgotten. However, at one time, and that was in the ancient world of culture, the fantasy was an openly acknowledged institution. The heroes, I recall Romulus and Remus, Semiramis, Moses, and many others, have been separated from their real parents. Others are directly sons of gods, and the noble races derive their family trees from heroes and gods. As one sees by this example, the fantasy of modern humanity is nothing but the re-echo of an old folk belief, which was very widespread originally. The ambitious fantasy chooses, among others, a form which is classic and which once had a true meaning. The same thing holds good in regard to the sexual fantasy. In the preamble we've spoken of dreams of sexual assault, the robber who breaks into the house and commits a dangerous act. That, too, is a mythological theme, and in the prehistoric era was certainly a reality, too, wholly apart from the fact that the capture of women was something general in the lawless prehistoric times. It was also a subject of mythology in cultivated epochs. I recall the capture of Proserpina, Deianira, Europa, the Sabine women, etc. We must not forget that even today, marriage customs exist in various regions that recall the ancient custom of marriage by capture. The symbolism of the instrument of coitus was an inexhaustible material for ancient fantasies. It furnished a widespread cult that was designated phallic, the object of reverence of which was the phallus. The companion of Dionysus was Phallus. A personification of the phallus proceeded from the phallic Herme of Dionysus. The phallic symbols were countless. Among the Sabines, the custom existed for the bridegroom to part the bride's hair with a lance. The bird, the fish, and the snake were phallic symbols. In addition, there existed in enormous quantities theriomorphic representations of the sexual instinct, in connection with which the bull, the he-goat, the ram, the boar, and the ass were frequently used. An undercurrent to this choice of symbol was furnished by the sodomitic inclination of humanity. When in the dream fantasy of modern man, the feared man is replaced by an animal, there is recurring in the ontogenetic re-echo the same thing which is openly represented by the ancients countless times. They are he-goats which pursued nymphs, satyrs with she-goats. In the still older times, in Egypt, there even existed a shrine of a goat god, which the Greeks called Pan, where the Hierodules prostituted themselves with goats. It's well known that this worship has not died out, but continues to live as a special custom in South Italy and Greece. Today we feel for such a thing nothing but the deepest abhorrence, and would never admit it still slumbered in our souls. Nevertheless, just as truly as the idea of the sexual assault is there, so are these things there too, which we should contemplate still more closely, not through moral eyeglasses with horror, but with interest as a natural science, since these things are venerable relics of past culture periods. We have, even today, a clause in our penal code against sodomy, but that which was once so strong as to give rise to a worship among a highly developed people has probably not wholly disappeared from the human soul during the course of a few generations. We may not forget that since the Symposium of Plato, in which homosexuality faces on all the same level with the so-called normal sexuality only 80 generations have passed. And what are 80 generations? They shrink to an imperceptible period of time when compared to the space of time which separates us from the Homo neanderthalensis or heidelbergensis. I might call to mind in this connection some choice thoughts of the great historian Guglielmo Ferrero. It is a common belief that the further man is separated from the present by time, the more does he differ from us in his thoughts and feelings. That the psychology of humanity changes from century to century, like fashions of literature. Therefore, no sooner do we find in present history an institution, a custom, a law, or a belief a little different from those which we are familiar, than we immediately search for some complex meaning which frequently resolves itself into phrases of doubtful significance. Indeed, man does not change so quickly. His psychology at bottom remains the same, and even if his culture varies much from one epoch to another, it doesn't change the functioning of his mind. The fundamental laws of the mind remain the same, at least during the short historical period of which we have knowledge, and all phenomena, even the most strange, must be capable of explanation by those common laws of the mind which we can recognize in ourselves. The psychologist should accept this viewpoint without reservation as peculiarly applicable to himself. Today, indeed, in our civilization, the phallic processions, the Dionysian mysteries of classical Athens, the barefaced phallic emblems, have disappeared from our coins, houses, temples, and streets. So also have the theriomorphic representations of the deity been reduced to small remnants, like the dove of the Holy Ghost, the Lamb of God, and the cock of Peter, adorning our church towers. In the same way, the capture and violation of women have shrunken away to crimes. Yet all of this does not affect the fact that we, in childhood, go through a period in which the impulses towards these archaic inclinations appear again and again, and that through all our lives we possess, side by side with newly recruited, directed, and adapted thought, a fantastic thought which corresponds to the thought of the centuries of antiquity and barbarism. Just as our bodies still keep the reminders of old function and conditions in many old-fashioned organs, so our minds too, which apparently have outgrown those archaic tendencies, nevertheless bear the marks of the evolution passed through, and the very ancient re-echoes, the least dreamily, in fantasies. The symbolism which Freud has discovered is revealed as an expression of a thinking and of an impulse limited to the dream, to wrong conduct, and to derangements of the mind, which form of thinking and impulse at one time ruled as the mightiest influence in past culture epochs. The question of whence comes the inclination and ability which enables the mind to express itself symbolically brings us to the distinction between the two kinds of thinking, the directed and adapted on one hand, and the subjective, fed by our own egotistic wishes on the other. The latter form of thinking, presupposing that it were not constantly corrected by the adapted thinking, must necessarily produce an overwhelmingly subjectively distorted idea of the world. We regard this state of mind as infantile. It lies in our individual past and the past of mankind. With this, we affirm the important fact that man in this fantastic thinking has kept a condensation of the psychic history of his development. An extraordinarily important task, which even today is hardly possible, is to give a systematic description of fantastic thinking. One may, at the most, sketch it. While directed thinking is a phenomenon conscious throughout, the same cannot be asserted of fantastic thinking. Doubtless, a great part of it still falls entirely in the realm of the conscious, but at least just as much goes along in half-shadows, and generally an undetermined amount in the unconscious, and this can therefore be disclosed only indirectly. By means of fantastic thinking, directed thinking is connected with the oldest foundations of the human mind, which have been for a long time beneath the threshold of the consciousness. The products of this fantastic thinking, arising directly from the consciousness, are, first, waking dreams or daydreams, to which Freud, Flerny, Pick, and others have given special attention. Then the dreams which offer to consciousness, at first, a mysterious exterior, and win meaning only through the indirectly inferred unconscious contents. Lastly, there is a so-called wholly unconscious fantasy system in the split-off complex, which exhibits a pronounced tendency towards the production of the dissociated personality. Our foregoing explanations show wherein the products arising from the unconscious are related to the mythical. From all these signs, it may be concluded that the soul possesses in some degree historical strata, the oldest stratum of which would correspond to the unconscious. The result of that must be that an introversion occurring in later life, according to the Freudian teaching, seizes upon regressive infantile reminiscences taken from the individual past. The first points out the way. Then with stronger introversion and regression, strong repressions, introversion, psychoses, there come to light pronounced traits of an archaic mental kind which, under certain circumstances, might go as far as the re-echo of a once manifest archaic mental product. This problem deserves to be thoroughly discussed. As a concrete example, let us take the history of the pious Abbé Ogar, which Anatole France has communicated to give us. The priest was a hypercritical man, and much given to fantasies, especially in regard to one question, viz. The fate of Judas. Whether he was really damned, as the teaching of the Church asserts, or everlasting punishment, or whether God had pardoned him after all. Oger sided with the intelligent point of view that God, in his all-wisdom, had chosen Judas as an instrument in order to bring about the highest point of the work of redemption by Christ. This necessary instrument, without the help of which the human race would not have been a sharer in salvation, could not possibly be damned by the all-good God. In order to put an end to his doubts, Oger went one night to the church and made supplication for a sign that Judas was saved. Then he felt a heavenly torch upon his shoulder. Following this, Oger told the archbishop of his resolution to go out into the world to preach God's unending mercy. Here, we have a richly developed fantasy system before us. It is concerned with the subtle and perpetually undecided question as to whether the legendary figure of Judas is damned or not. The Judas legend is, in itself, mythical material, viz. The malicious betrayal of a hero. I recall Siegfried and Hagen, Balder and Loki. Siegfried and Balder were murdered by a faithless traitor from among their closest associates. This myth is moving and tragic. It's not honorable battle which kills the noble, but evil treachery. It is, too, an occurrence which is historical over and over again. One thinks of Caesar and Brutus. Since the myth of such a deed is very old, and still the subject of teaching and repetition, it is the expression of a psychological fact that envy does not allow humanity to sleep, and that all of us carry in a hidden recess of our heart a deadly wish towards the hero. This rule can be applied generally to mythical tradition. It does not set forth any account of the old events, but rather acts in such a way that it always reveals a thought common to humanity, and once more rejuvenated. Thus, for example, the lives and deeds of the founders of old religions are the purest condensations of typical contemporaneous myths, behind which the individual figure entirely disappears. But why does our pious Abbé torment himself with the old Judas legend? He first went into the world to preach the gospel of mercy, and then, after some time, he separated from the Catholic Church and became a Swedenborgian. Now we understand his Judas fantasy. He was the Judas who betrayed the Lord. Therefore, first of all, he had to make sure of the divine mercy in order to be Judas in peace. This case throws light upon the mechanism of the fantasies in general. The known, conscious fantasy may be of mythical or other material. It is not to be taken seriously as such, for it has an indirect meaning. If we take it, however, as important per se, then the thing is not understandable, and makes one despair of the efficiency of the mind. But we saw, in the case of Abbé Oger, that his doubts and his hopes did not turn upon the historical problem of Judas, but upon his own personality, which wished to win a way to freedom for itself through the solution of the Judas problem. The conscious fantasies tell us of mythical or other material, of underdeveloped or no longer recognized with tendencies of the soul. As is easily understood, an innate tendency, an acknowledgment of which one refuses to make, and which one treats as non-existent, can hardly contain a thing that may be in accord with our conscious character. It concerns the tendencies which are considered immoral, and is generally impossible, and the strongest resentment is felt towards bringing them into the consciousness. What would Oger have said had he been told confidentially that he was preparing himself for the Judas role? And what in ourselves do we consider immoral and non-existent, or which we at least wish were non-existent? It is that which in antiquity lay widespread on the surface, viz. Sexuality in all its various manifestations. Therefore, we need not wonder in the least when we find this at the base of most of our fantasies, even if the fantasies have a different appearance. Because Uger found the damnation of Judas incompatible with God's goodness, he thought about the conflict in that way. That is the conscious sequence. Along with this is the unconscious sequence. Because Uger himself wished to be a Judas, he first made sure the goodness of God. To Uger, Judas was the symbol of his own unconscious tendency, and he made use of the symbol in order to be able to meditate over his unconscious wish. The direct coming of consciousness of the Judas wish would have been too painful for him. Thus, there must be typical myths which are really the instruments of a folk psychological complex treatment. Jacob Burckhardt seems to have suspected this when he once said that every Greek of the classical era carried in himself a fragment of the Oedipus, just as every German carries a fragment of Faust. The problem, which the simple story of Abbe Uger has brought clearly before us, confronts us again, when we prepare to examine fantasies which owe their existence this time to an exclusively unconscious work. We are indebted for the material which we will use in the following chapter to the useful publication of an American woman, Miss Frank Miller, who has given to the world some poetical, unconsciously formed fantasies under the title Quelques faits d'imagination créatrice subconsciente, Volume 5, Archives de Psychologie, 1906.